6:10, is that thing not on again? It's 6:10 p.m. on Monday, June the 20th. Reason this public hearing is to discuss the redistricting of council districts. Mr. Duke, will you give us your presentation at this time, please, sir? Oh, excuse me. I have to call the roll. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Councilman Strickland. Here. Councilman Wood. Here. Councilman Argo.
Here.
Councilman Reniger.
Here.
Councilman Miller. Here. Councilman Bowles.
Here.
Councilman Fank.
Thank you. Mr. Duke.
Yes, sir. Good evening. I will try to cut down this presentation a little bit. It was prepared with the anticipation of having a room full of folks, and no offense to Ms. Boone, I'm glad she came. But I think some of this is something that some facts that you already know, but also recognizing that this will be on the internet, we'll go ahead and cover most of it. With the release of the initial data from the 2010 census, the Census Bureau confirmed what we all experienced over the last decade, that Prattville's population has increased significantly, increasing by 9,657 people since 2000. The city's population on register is at 33,960. Among Alabama's 20 most populous cities, Prattville's growth rate is surpassed by only the city of Madison. So you can see that we have been growing rapidly over the last decade. And while we could certainly discuss the impacts of that growth on the city's operations and our community, tonight we're here to discuss its effect on city council representation. When the council districts were last redrawn in 2003, each councilor represented 3,766 constituents. Based on the 2010 census numbers, the ideal population of each district has increased by 1,085 to 4,851 residents. Unfortunately, the city's new residents were not considered enough to distribute themselves evenly throughout your 7 districts. And those districts having the most desirable and available land for development, such as districts 1, 3, 4, and 7, have received the bulk of the population increase. Due to the construction or expansion of 3 apartment complexes and other housing in District 4, that district now holds approximately 27% of the total population. You have before you a table that shows, and it's also shown on these maps, and for those viewing on the internet, on YouTube, we'll try to get this as a part of the presentation. If nothing else, it'll be on the internet site. You can see each district as it was laid out in 2003, and that was a redistricting that was beyond the 2000 census number, so it might have been off just a little bit because there were a good number of estimates that were thrown into that process based on the approximately 30 or so annexations that we had in 2001 and 2002. But you can see that the districts were basically evenly distributed at that time. And you can see in the column that's shown in gray that the district populations have grown significantly, as discussed in District 4, District 1, District 3, and have held pretty well steady in 5 and 6. Those are the 2 districts that are kind of in the center of the city and haven't experienced that much in the way of new development. And I apologize, I meant to say if there are any questions at any point, please stop me. We can jump off in any directions you'd like to go. So since we have determined that city council districts, as they were drawn in 2000 and modified in minor ways in 2008, no longer serve to divide the population equally, the council has initiated a process to adjust the boundaries. While several of you have been through the process of redistricting and are familiar with some of the legal considerations, I think it would be helpful if we go through a few of those this evening and make sure that we're all on the same page. The first legal consideration is the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says in the Equal Protection Clause that we'll abide by one man, one vote, meaning that we should have equal representation as much as reasonably possible in each of the districts. The second consideration is state law. In Section 1140, Section 11-40-8, city councils are required to divide their jurisdictions into districts having nearly equal inhabitants using the center lines of streets and alleys as far as possible. That same code section also states that boundaries shall not be adjusted within 3 months of an election or within 18 months of the last adjustment. A further consideration is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This federal legislation in Section 2 prohibits voter discrimination or any act or procedure that has a discriminatory result. Section 5 of that act requires a process called preclearance, and in that, any operation that impacts voting, such as a redistricting or an annexation, the relocation of a polling place, must be reviewed by the Attorney General prior to its enforcement. And the final consideration from a legal standpoint is a case, a landmark case in Alabama titled Dillard versus Crenshaw. And in that case, in 1986, John Dillard and other African-American Alabamians filed suit against Crenshaw County and 8 other counties alleging violations of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. In that case, they were challenging the election of county commissioners by at-large elections. When it was discovered by the federal court that most Alabama cities and counties and school boards were also following a process of at-large elections, that was brought into a class action suit, and that's where it became important to the city of Prattville. Prattville was included in that 183 Alabama cities, counties, and school boards that were required to change their method of election. Prior to that case, the city of Prattville had an at-large election where city councilors basically were, as I said, elected at large instead of by district. After that case, and starting with the 1988 election, were elected by 7-member districts. So I hope that gives you a clear picture of where we are at this point. That redistricting is definitely necessary from a practical standpoint and also from a legal standpoint. You've already taken the step to appoint a committee, and that committee has met and has established a procedure that I believe they've presented to you by way of a resolution for your consideration tomorrow night, basically defining a process that's open, has a defined time schedule, and is looking for public input. And this hearing tonight is the beginning of that public input. We will certainly not limit that to this hearing. Folks are welcome to submit any comments they have. We're just asking that they do that by roughly around July the 1st. So if there's something that needs to be taken into consideration when we start drawing the lines or looking at different options, that we have those comments available. The process is also looking, I believe, to have this looking to have this process completed roughly a year ahead of your 2012 election, and that would allow us to submit that to the Justice Department for Voting Rights Act preclearance by before the end of the year. Mr. President, that is the extent of my comments. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from Mr. Duke from the council before I put it out to the general public? Councilman Miller.
Can you remind me what date the election is that we're backing it up by that time frame? It's August.
I apologize, Mr. Miller. I don't have the exact date. I'll be glad to get that for you. I believe it's the latter, at least the I want to say the third week in August.
Okay,
Third
that's
The
good.
third Tuesday in August,
Thank you.
2012.
Councilman Argo.
Yes, Mr. President. Would like to just make a couple real quick comments. Mr. Duke has done a fabulous job in paving the way for us to begin our work as a council. The redistricting committee, we have already met. We have met with Mr. Duke. We've gone over the information that you see before you on the map. The committee, of course, is Councilman Striplin, Councilman Wood, and myself. The recommendations that Joel has already enumerated, which sets out our procedure for us to proceed, will be in a resolution tomorrow evening on the agenda. What the committee is looking at is, number one, we want to try to make sure that we, as a committee and as a council, have this plan finished and ready for the council to vote on by the second meeting in August. Or actually, we have it work completed by the second meeting in August and ready for voting the first meeting in October, which would give us 1 year in order for our citizens to become comfortable, to find out what districts they live in. It would give the registrar's office plenty of time to make changes to their data and to make sure that as we proceed, people will know exactly where they stand. As a council, I'm sure each of you, as you have made your campaigns in the past and will do so in the future, that there are some things that are important that the committee wants to make sure that the council is aware of, and that is what the committee is going to try to do and what we're going to bring to the council, and we think that you will endorse that, again, based on your experiences. We want to try to keep neighborhoods whole where possible. We don't want to split neighborhoods except that absolutely necessary. We want to make sure that current boundary lines are respected so that we're not jumping into other people's neighborhoods and district lines and backyards and so forth. We want to make sure that the dividing lines in districts, as we have tried to do the last couple of times we've had to redistrict, and that is where the dividing line will be at the rear property line with neighbors, so that we're not dividing streets where one neighbor votes in one place and the neighbor across the street votes in another place. We want to try to make sure that we take into consideration that the districts be compact as possible. We do know that there are some extenuating circumstances where that may not be possible in one district, but we want to try to be as compact as possible. As you can see the map, we're spread out from left to right and not necessarily from top to bottom. We've talked about in years past where the council has actually passed a resolution asking our legislative delegation to basically draw a circle around the city, and we do a mass annexation so that we're all filled in, but that's not been possible in the past. And since we're undertaking this procedure, that's not a good thing for us to do at this particular time. We would just have to redistrict all over again. We want to make sure that our voting centers are maintained so that people are not being pushed to one voting center where they have away from a center that they voted in all their lives. We want to try to keep that if possible. And then, of course, we want to make sure that, if you tell somebody where your district is and you say, well, my district's basically divided on Highway 14, we want to try to keep that boundary line intact, and we don't want to change that if at all possible. But I think that the challenges ahead of us are going to be many because of the way that our population has grown and where it has grown. We're going to have to make some concessions in some places. Obviously, with District 4 having 4,200 more people currently than the current number that we're trying to shoot for, the 4,800 number, there's going to have to be some areas that are going to have to be taken out of District 4. And then, of course, in District 2, where there's been a loss of population, there's going to have to be some places where District 2 is going to have to grow, as well as in a couple of the other districts as well. District 1 is not going to be quite as difficult because, again, much of what you see on that map especially on the left-hand portion on the other side of Highway 82. That's mostly uninhabited areas. There are some neighborhoods that have grown over the last couple of years that we'll have to take into consideration. But that district, even though it's very large land mass-wise, it's not as large as you would expect it to be given the number of acres that's included. But there will have to be some areas carved out of District 1 and placed in other districts as well. But the committee is, once we have this public hearing and we adopt the resolution tomorrow evening setting out our procedures, then the committee is ready to hit the ground running. We're ready to begin work. And again, we know that we want to try to be finished towards the end of August, which we're hopeful that we'll be able to have another public involvement meeting at that point and be able to bring information forward where the public will actually have something to react to, whereas tonight they're basically being asked to just bring forward ideas before we even really get started. So we're confident that we'll have something ready by the end of August and then ready for the council to vote on the first meeting in October. And Mr. President, I think that pretty much gets us to where we need to be tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Argo. Any other comments or questions from the council before we open it up? Councilman Miller.
One more. I know the ideal district population is 4851, according to your latest figures, but in looking at 03, it looks like they all sort of were more or less uniform in terms of achieving what was ideal at that point in time. But walk me through again briefly how much and to what degree you factor in projected growth such that, you know, if we were doing this today and knew District 4 had certain, you know, components that made it more likely to have this higher rate of growth, do you sort of start out trying to get such a district with a lower number than the target and some on the flip side that are relatively stagnant compared to some of the more growth-prone areas? Do you adjust them, so to speak, relative to your ideal? In other words, does a one-size-fit-all really what we're aiming for, or do you factor in some of that other aspect?
Councilman Miller, the first thing we're going to try to do is equalize the districts and try to come up with a plan that is satisfactory to the council members. Once we've achieved that, then we will start looking at where there might be the ability to back up. It's acceptable for you to have a 10% deviation, plus or minus 5%, on any of these districts. So once we've achieved or as close to the ideal as we can get, we'll start looking at those considerations. For instance, District 3, because of what we know about development or what we expect in the way of development over the next 10 years, will be a growth area. And it won't take very long before it's in the situation that District 4 is now. District 4 certainly still has areas that are ripe for, certainly for multifamily development with the completion of Old Farm Lane, so we would be looking to possibly bring those districts in on the low end or in the minus 5% category, as close to the edge of that 5% as we could get it, just to allow for some growth. That election at the end of the decade is going to be prior to the release of the 2020 census data, so you won't have really an opportunity to redistrict before that time period. So you want to kind of make these districts something that can carry over into that time period at the end of the decade. I hope that answered your question. You have some flexibility with that plus or minus 5%, and you should use it where you think there's going to be some growth.
But you do anticipate recommended use of that judiciously, just to sort of temper a little bit of the emerging lopsidedness that's just sort of a part of the way things happen.
Certainly. We have the legal considerations that I outlined, and those are paramount, dealing with the Voting Rights Act, compliance with the consent decree out of the Dillard versus Crenshaw case, making sure that we don't have a situation where we're backing up with minority representation. And so those will be considerations first, and if we can get through those and then consider building in some growth to these developing districts, then we'll do that.
Thank you.
Anything else from the council? Mrs. Boone, would you like to address the council? Or Mr. Duke, since you seem to be the only member of the general public other than the press?
I haven't seen the preliminary drawing up of what y'all are proposing, so I may be preaching to the choir. I may not. Well, so only the districting committee has seen what's proposed. Or y'all are still.
I'm sorry, there has been no map drawn whatsoever. We have not gotten to that point. We wanted to have the public input hearing first, set out our procedures, and once we have this, then we'll start working on with Mr. Duke where the census data takes us. We'll then draw a map at that point, and then that's where the second public hearing will come in at the end of August, so that the public will have actually something they can look at and react to. But as of this point, there's been no work whatsoever done on any map.
Okay.
What we have is what we currently have.
Well, what I have is a small suggestion, and I'm not obviously experienced on the planning committee, so this may be something that Joel has thought of long before me. But obviously a lot of the growth in District 4, and especially in 4, I'm not sure about 1, but in 4 would probably be to multi-family housing, apartment living, that sort of thing tends to be where our growth is booming in those districts. And my thoughts are we're going to have more transient folks living in these apartments, not as likely to establish residency, not as likely to transfer their voting. Many of them who have moved into that district may not even be voting in that district. So my suggestion might be that while we have to make some cuts in one district population-wise, that we don't take meat and potatoes neighborhoods out, that we keep those there so that their main voters stay in that district, whereas a lot of the apartment voters, while it might be a growth in population, it might not be a growth in our voters. So, and I'm sure that some of the people in there are ready to get established, and they may even be building in that district and staying here. Some people do that. Some people simply are coming here to get into the school system or, a job that's temporary. I've lived in an apartment myself for a short period of time. I did not move my voter registration. I kept it. I voted. I knew I was going to be there for 6 months only, and so I didn't think it was worth going through all those steps. So just a very short suggestion that we possibly, while we take into the numbers into consideration, that we not take those numbers as a whole for voting, that we kind of look at that as how many of those are transient. So just very small.
That's a very good point, and also that point can be used to talk about the military as well, because many of the military that reside here never moved their voting from where they originally lived. Right. So they're here and they reside here, but they don't vote here. So you make a very good point, and I appreciate you pointing that out.
One other thing, just a point of privilege kind of thing. I was looking at his statistics over there, and I'm personally responsible for 2 of the Hispanics who live in Prattville. So I was tickled at the statistics there, so I thought, well, yes, I've brought 2 of those in. Any other questions?
Anything from Mrs. Boone? Thank you so much for being here with us. Anything else to come before the council pertaining to this subject? I'll entertain a motion to close the public hearing. So moved. It's been moved, seconded? Second. Close the public hearing. Thank you so much.